how chilled should we be about an early election? Will it be in the autumn? Is that there's the whispers? Rishi Sunak, where he's talking Rwanda today, inflation coming down tomorrow potentially.
It suddenly occurred to me that me having said it'll be in October, Peter saying he thought it might be May, and Polly saying she thought it'd be January, that he'd end up calling it in July, and therefore to make us all look wrong. I think there is at least a chance of that. The thing that militates against it is Scottish schools going on holiday at the end of June. But the thing that militates in favour of it is I can't think that I've heard a lot of talk about how they don't think that things will improve for them politically by the autumn, and so therefore they may as well go now and not, be prisoner of events between now and then. But when I originally suggested they ought to go in May, one of my thoughts was that the economy might be better in May and get worse, but I don't think that's now going to happen. So I still think October, November, but there's just a little bit, people should just keep a little bit of a thought. There's a bit of talk in government circles. I picked it up.
I think there may be another reason why it may be July.
Go on.
The Labour Party campaign director, Morgan McSweeney, lives in Scotland with his wife and kid Magnus, and they're going on holiday in July. And I have a horrible, sneaky feeling that the Prime Minister's got wind of this.
I thought everyone was banned from going on holiday now in the Labour Party. But presumably if you're Morgan McSweeney, you can do what you like.
He's the boss. He can do what he likes. And he's going off on holiday in July. So I think that's probably a dead cert. Election in July.
How were the best of the rest?
They were good. I mean, there's a lot of tension around whether or not we are expecting some sort of announcement at some point. And I think PMQs, when there was lots of speculation and when that speculation wasn't directly addressed in the head-to-head by Starmer and Sunak.
For people who aren't across this, the speculation is that Rishi Sunak could be about to call a snap general election for July the 4th to scupper the plans of people who are expecting it in the autumn. But then there was no mention of it certainly between him and Keir Starmer.
No, there was no mention of it, and Stephen Flynn did mention it, that we'll talk about, but also there was, I think, quite an interesting question which was less of a question and more of a electioneering statement from Danny Kruger, who
Not
is
a question,
of course,
more of a statement. Yeah.
Danny Kruger, who is, of course, one of the MPs that's not naturally considered to be a kind of key Rishi Sunak ally, I think it's fair to say. He's on the right of the party, and he made a statement basically criticising Labour and I think laying out what he thinks should be some of the key Conservative messages if indeed that election is to be confirmed.
So who are we going to first?
We're going to Kruger first.
OK, this is the Tory MP, Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 1997, the public voted in what they were told would be a sort of continuity Conservative government, the same policies, just with different faces. Instead, what they got was record immigration, constitutional vandalism, and a broken economy. Does the Prime Minister agree that with the economy now roaring back to life under a Conservative government, the last thing we need is a return to the failed Labour recipe of high taxes, open borders, and employment laws that destroy jobs?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend gives a superb and passionate economic diagnosis, and he's right. Inflation is now back to normal, and indeed lower than France, Germany, the United States, at its lowest level in years. Our economy is growing faster, wages are rising, and that's why we need to stick to the plan that is working, Mr. Speaker. And he's right to point out the risks of what the Labour Party proposed. 70 new laws. 70 new laws. They've caved in to their union paymasters, and what does that mean? It means it will cost jobs and damage our economic recovery.
It was quite a bold move to talk about record migration in the week where we were expecting net migration figures out. It's tomorrow, isn't it? Thursday. And net migration has been higher, much higher in the last 3-4 years than any period during the Labour government.
Well, and the Labour Party will listen to a line like that and hear Rishi Sunak's very enthusiastic answer to it, especially citing statistical comparisons with Italy and France and Germany, and they'll say, this is great. You don't get it at all. You don't get our campaign at all. See also Rachel Reeves's piece in The Sun this morning on inflation, which was headlined, "Forget the graphs, look in your bank account." You know, Labour's line on all of this is no matter how promising the economic data or the migration numbers, voters don't feel it. And that's the terrain they want to fight the next election on. So I suspect that exchange does sound like the basis for a perfectly coherent Tory campaign. It's one Labour feel they're very prepared to fight.
Okay, who are we going to next then, Lara?
So now we're going to address that election speculation directly, which is Stephen Flynn, who is, of course, the SNP's Westminster leader, and who asked Sunak about it directly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I begin by also welcoming the member from South Thanet back to the chamber. He is indeed an inspiration to all of us. Mr. Speaker, speculation is rife, so I think the public deserve a clear answer to a simple question. Does the Prime Minister intend to call a summer general election, or is he feared?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, as I have said repeatedly to him, there is, Mr. Speaker, spoiler alert, there is going to be a general election in the second half of this year, and at that moment, the British people will in fact see the truth about the honourable gentleman opposite me, because that will be the choice at the next election, Mr. Speaker. A party that is not able to say to the country what they would do, a party that would put at risk our hard-earned economic stability, or the Conservatives that are delivering a secure future for our United Kingdom.
Right, what can we read from that, Patrick? It is word for word. There is, Mr. Speaker, spoiler alert, there is going to be a general election in the second half of this year.
The 4th of July is in the second half of this year.
Yeah. So we're no further forwards, are we, Lara?
It's not a denial of the thing that people are talking about today, no.
No, it's not. But as Patrick says, the second half of next year is quite soon.
Does it sound like it's... I can't work it out. Would you do it now, today, just because inflation's hit 2.3%?
Things aren't going to get any better, are they?
Well, they might do.
Well, depends if you listen to the IMF or somebody else or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's, I think also, despite the good news today, obviously it's that the fact that it didn't fall as quickly, inflation does look to some in the Conservative Party like a rate cut as soon as next month is now vanishingly unlikely. And of course, cutting interest rates for millions of homeowners was central to the message that Rishi Sunak wanted to tell come the election. And they may well feel that that's not going to be coming as soon as we had originally hoped. We've got that news on inflation where we can spin it as being back to normal, as we heard Rishi Sunak and indeed Hunt do this morning, and also given the difficulty that some feel they are likely to have over getting a significant number of Rwanda flights off the ground before the election, you might well see the case for an early election as not particularly silly.
What about the argument about having an election in July when Scotland is on holiday?
Well, look, it depends. If they're held on the 4th of July, that's basically the beginning of the private school holidays and the Scottish school holidays. So it might. I think that might be the last window to do it without running into that problem in a massive way. I don't know whether Number 10 will think that's a deal breaker, though. It's these are the conversations that will be happening when Number 10 are mulling the election date.
Presumably they're not expected to make massive gains in Scotland.
Well, there are a couple of seats in Scotland the Tories hope to win. They think they can pick up 2 or 3 actually, as backlash to the SNP continues. It would probably be about the only place in the country they do gain seats, bizarrely. Imagine saying that 10 years ago.
But I guess the question is, Labour might be more likely to win more seats if you wait for longer and Labour improve in the polls. I think in the most recent YouGov poll, they had a 10-point lead
in Scotland
over the SNP. So that's, I think, another thing.
Yeah, which by some calculations would have left the SNP with 8 MPs. So
that maybe those are all reasons for it. But if you were listening to How to Win an Election yesterday, you'll have heard a lot of this speculation set running by Danny Finkelstein. Let's take a listen to what, of course, knows Rishi Sunak well. This is what you had to say yesterday.
I've heard a lot of talk about how they don't think that things will improve for them politically by the autumn, and so therefore they may as well go now and not, be prisoner of events between now and then. But when I originally suggested they ought to go in May, one of my thoughts was that the economy might be better in May and get worse, but I don't think that's now going to happen. So I still think October, November, but there's just a little bit, people should just keep a little bit of a thought. There's a bit of talk in government circles, I picked it up.
So Danny picked up a bit of talk. Peter Mandelson said a reason for the Tories to do it in July was because Morgan McSweeney, who we've been discussing, the chief
Patrick's eyes light up.
Labour strategist, is going on. Peter announced that Morgan's going on holiday in July.
Yeah, indeed. Well, perhaps they were listening and thought this is our opportunity. Now Labour's top man is not on the scene. I assume Morgan McSweeney has probably already cancelled his holiday.
He might well have.
And was presumably not enthusiastic about his holiday to start with.
Yeah. Right, so there we are. Go on then. Marks out of 10. What's the chances, Lara?
There's also the chance that you announce it, but it's not an early election. You say we're going to name the date, but it's slightly later.
Oh, that'd be interesting, wouldn't it? Why don't you just name the date? This is the date in November.
Maybe.
What would be what would be the downside of doing that?
Summer boat crossings.
No, but that's going to happen anyway. Rather than having every week going through this rigmarole and then being accused of being a chicken, just say, I'm going to end the speculation. Here's the date.
I don't know. Well, look, it's interesting that... what time is his audience with the King? Is it in the evening or is it in the mid-afternoon? Is that why Cabinet's at 4? So he can come to Cabinet and say, I've just been to see the King and I've requested a dissolution.
But he wouldn't normally bother telling the Cabinet, would they?
No, but you'd have to tell the Cabinet afterwards.
But you don't have to tell the Cabinet you're calling an election, do you?
Well, no, you wouldn't tell them ahead of time. You go and request the dissolution, then say, listen, guys, I've just requested dissolution. We're having an election.
I don't know if you need to I don't even need to get them in at all, do you?
Well, it's common courtesy now.
Is it?
Usually they do, don't they? Did Theresa May in 2017? Don't think she did.
No. Well, I don't know. I was at Disneyland. Having been told by a very senior member of Theresa May's government I was safe to go to Disneyland because there wouldn't be an election.
Let's just clear up the stuff that we know so far about the possibility of an election being called, because we are piecing this all together. It's I don't know what it is. Is it a chess picture at the moment, a mahjong board? What is it that we're seeing happen in front of us? It's all to do with what people are wearing and where Grant Shapps is.
Well, yeah, and David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, has been called back from abroad to attend a cabinet meeting. That really set some hairs running, I think. Jeremy Hunt, as we know, has now pulled out of a TV appearance on Peston later on. Everything seems to be indicating that he is going to call an election. I think if he wasn't to call it now, after all the speculation throughout the day, and having had an opportunity to kill off the speculation, he would look like he'd bottled it. So I think it's inevitable now that we're heading for an election in July, either the 4th or July the 11th, I think.
Do you think it would be a good call?
Well, if you look at it objectively, you think, well, they're still miles behind Labour in the polls. I mean, 20 points on average, and those polls have been rock solid for months now, pretty much since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. So on the one hand, that does look like mad to go to the country in that set of circumstances. However, the economic indicators are better. We only got this morning that inflation is now down to 2.3%. It's quite interesting that Rishi Sunak said he described that as being back to normal. So I think, that gives him a platform to go out and say, stick with the plan, as he's been saying. It's working. We've turned a corner. Don't take a risk with Labour. But Labour will turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, you've had 14 years, it's time for a change.
What about the Rwanda flights? Because when we've talked about when an election might be before, there has been this idea that to see a plane take off would be a good optic ahead of an election. And if it were to be on either July the 4th or the 11th, could the government be certain that that flight would have gone? Have you ever thought that that would be a good optic?
Well, obviously the promise was to stop the boats. This promise that Rishi Sunak made when he became Prime Minister was never to get a flight off to Rwanda. So it's a pretty low bar that he's looking to clear. But given the agonies that they've gone through to try and get this far, I suppose he could point to it as signs of progress. But we're in the middle of a year now where record numbers are still coming over in small boats. So again, I think that's quite an easy target for the opposition to say, well, he's failed. But the optics of it, I guess he could say, well, look, we're making progress. Again, stick with the plan. Things are heading in the right direction. Don't take a risk with Labour is what he will look to say. But then again, it's not guaranteed that the flights will take off before it. If we get to an election day and not a single flight has taken off for whatever reason, then I think he's just going to he'll live to regret it.
We've also speculated that it might not be a good optic if it's a very big plane with only a couple of people on it. If there are 5 guards to every one person, it's a bit of an own goal for the opposition to take it apart. And as you say, drawing that line between flights taking off and the numbers of people coming on boats, it would seem to point to the fact that the criminal gangs are not saying, don't go over there because you'll end up in Rwanda.
Yeah, well, the whole point of it's meant to be a deterrent, isn't it? And thus far, it hasn't proved to be a deterrent. Far from it. As we say, the numbers have actually gone up this year. And I think if it were to be the case that it be a small number on the planes, which is absolutely possible, then Labour could turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, this is costing a fortune. They would quickly do the sums and work out, well, it's cost $500,000 or whatever to send one person over to Rwanda. Is that good value for money? That's just another sign of a government in chaos, which has been the Labour line for quite some time.
Just one more political question, and then we will return to the Post Office inquiry. The idea that Jeremy Hunt might be departing from his post as Chancellor, would that be enough to bring very senior figures in the government around a cabinet table this afternoon?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be enough to get David Cameron. I think if David Cameron had to jump on a plane early to say, what, you mean to say I've come back for this? So no, I don't think so. Although, interestingly, after Prime Minister's questions today, there's usually a little huddle, as we call it, with the Prime Minister's spokesman to ask questions. And she would not reaffirm that Jeremy Hunt will be the Chancellor come the general election. So read into that what you will.
Lots more speculation. I've just heard that Jeremy Hunt has apparently pulled out of doing Robert Peston's show tonight, Kevin. I don't know why my voice has gone really high.
Well, Robert Peston did tweet earlier that he believed he was going to call an election, but he couldn't say why. But I guess that must be it. He must have known that Jeremy Hunt had pulled out. Now that indicates to me that it's definitely happening.
Oh my.
Just behind me in Downing Street, we understand that they have been told about what is likely to come next. And you can tell from the number of journalists down here, broadcasters, photographers, that something was up. There's been something in the air all day here in Westminster, but we're expecting to find out very shortly exactly what that is.
Kate, have you got time for a quick chat, or do you need to Zoom somewhere? I just wanted to ask you a question, actually. Tim was talking about how dirty this election is going to be by comparison to elections that you and I will have known and loved before. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to be a very difficult election for the Conservatives to fight, and that is largely because they are so far behind in the polls. I mean, if you look at recent polling, 20 points is a long way between the two. Now, we may well see those polls narrow a little bit in the coming weeks, but it is going to be a really difficult fight back for the Conservatives. We were just talking before, weren't we, about the local elections and quite how bad things were for the Tories at that moment in time. That really isn't that far away. It wasn't that long ago, rather. And those campaigners, many of whom would have lost their council seats, are now going to have to turn out and pound the streets for the Tories to win the next election. That's going to be really difficult. And I think we've had a flavour over the last couple of weeks of where that campaign is likely to go. There is a desire from the Tories to find those wedge issues, the splits between Labour and the Conservatives, and really play them up. Some of those are on defence and security, for example. Others are likely to be on immigration and those so-called kind of cultural issues, the culture war issues that we've seen both parties talk about in recent weeks. I think from Labour's perspective, they want to try and do as much as they can to avoid getting down to that level. But it would be very difficult in an election campaign when both sides really, clearly have a lot to lose. I think for the Conservatives, it's going to be a very difficult and emotional one.
Absolutely. And the promise of a very sincere and profound changing political landscape, not least for some of the big guns. There was a recent, was it a YouGov poll that estimated that 11 cabinet ministers might not actually be able to keep hold of their jobs. And when you consider it like that, you think, OK, right, the gloves are going to be off, aren't they?
Yeah, they really will be. And I think, it's worth just pointing out here as well that there are a number of quite senior MPs, Conservative MPs for the most part, who will not be standing again in this election campaign. So there will be candidates standing in those seats who will be there working for the first time. And the mood in Parliament over recent weeks and months has not been great. Those local elections didn't help. I think all MPs will go into this campaign feeling a bit frustrated, actually, largely because the Prime Minister had promised them that they were not going to have to fight a summer election campaign, even given advisors and staffers the permission to take holiday. Obviously that has now changed, as all things can in politics, but so much of campaigning is about mood and morale, and I think the Prime Minister will have to do quite a lot with whatever he's about to say to really get his team excited about what comes next. For Labour, I mean, they've been grinning all day long in Parliament. They've been calling for an election for a long time. They say they're ready. They say their manifesto was ready for an election in May. I think the reality is they'll probably need to do a little bit of honing of that. We saw some of that last week with Keir Starmer's first 6 steps, but they are certainly up for the challenge and up for the fight, and that is a party really enthused about going out on the doorstep and selling itself. Everything can change in election campaigns, but I think, as I said at the start, it's a very difficult hill to climb for the Tories. Whatever happens in this general election, it will be a record breaker. Either Labour will come back from the biggest kind of far behind as anyone has ever been to win an election, or the Tories will win a record term. So yeah, it's going to be a fascinating campaign.
Can I just make one tiny comment on the optics this afternoon, Kate? They could not be worse. We can hear the rain on your umbrella. I've got you envisioned here in the studio. I mean, it is damp in London. It is nasty. It's gone a bit cold again. If it were a Greek tragedy, you would sense that the portents and the entrails were terribly bad.
Yeah, although I'm fairly happy. I've got my raincoat on, which you can see, but maybe our listeners can't. But, you know, look, I think the reality is, for Rishi Sunak, there will have been a calculation that today's economic news was the moment to go for it. It is also, though, a fair recognition that at the end of the day, things are probably unlikely to get much better.
So I think, John, it's fair to say that things couldn't have got much worse for the Prime Minister. It looked like the rain was breaking. It then turned up the volume as soon as the Prime Minister walked out. He ended up looking, well, completely drenched to the skin, it's fair to say. And you can probably still hear the music over behind me. It is, as you say, Labour's campaign track. Things can only get better. The rain here is, in fact, getting harder. But look, you know, beyond the optics, which, of course, don't look good for the Prime Minister, the reality is all through that speech, I was getting texts from Tories saying, well, that's it. I'm doomed now. I thought I had more time. I now don't. My campaigners are not ready. They're frustrated. I thought I had more time in Parliament to sort things out. I don't. That's very difficult for me to bear. One former cabinet minister just saying this is absolutely diabolical. He looks like a fool. I think some big questions about why the Prime Minister chose to do this speech the way that he has today. But John, in terms of that substance, I have to say, when the Prime Minister first started speaking, I thought, and I don't know whether you thought this too, it sounded as if the Prime Minister was making a resignation speech. He was talking about how, you know, I'll never leave the people of this country to face their darkest days alone. I did everything within my power to provide the best protection in the pandemic. It was a bit of a kind of greatest hits roundup, if you like, of the things that Rishi Sunak has done before. He then, of course, moved on to talking about the reasons why he believes the timing is right, including the improving economic situation. And he says the fact that he is tackling immigration. But John, a really important point to make on that one, we haven't seen any of those Rwanda flights leave yet, and we are still around 5 to 6 weeks away from even Downing Street's sort of best guess in terms of when those could leave. So I think there will still be some pretty big questions from Tory MPs after that speech, and a very interesting tone, I thought. It didn't feel like a Prime Minister who was launching a jubilant, excited election campaign. It sounded like a man who knows he's got a huge amount to prove and a pretty big hill to climb.
Kate, I have to say that private message to you from a cabinet minister saying the Prime Minister, and this was the quote, I think, looks like a fool, is the last thing any Prime Minister, any Downing Street team would ever want to hear discussed at a moment like this, as the Prime Minister announces what now will be General Election Day on July the 4th, a summer snap election. We're going to talk in a moment to Paul Scully, the Conservative MP and former Minister. But Tim, watching that with us, along with Ian Martin here in the studio, I've got to say, you were not impressed.
It was a brilliant summary by Kate. Look, I've been a critic of the Prime Minister, but I'm fundamentally a Conservative. I want the Conservatives to minimise the defeat at this election. I was hoping that they knew what they were doing today, but that image of the Prime Minister getting drenched, not even having the sort of sure-footedness to make a joke about it, you know, showing a little bit of sort of humour and humanity, self-deprecation about what obviously is going to dominate the front pages of the newspapers tomorrow, those pictures of not just a slightly damp, but a completely sodden suit that he was wearing. You know, why didn't they built that press conference inside Number 10, beautiful press conference, which would have avoided Labour's theme tune being played in the background. Things can only get better, and I see already over Twitter, things can only get wetter, is what everyone's saying. That will be on a few newspaper front pages tomorrow. This is not the launch that the Tories wanted. And Kate's obviously hearing from a cabinet minister. My sources are more lowly than Kate's, but Tory MPs are still furious. I'm getting messages one after another. They weren't expecting this. They don't think the timing's right. And I think the story over the next few days might partly be significantly about Tory MPs' noises of complaining about the Prime Minister. I hope that's not the case. We all the Conservative Party all needs to get on board now. But there are going to be quite a lot of it's not going to be the united launch that Rishi Sunak would have hoped.
That was absolutely shocking. I mean, you have seen a lot in politics, John. I've been around, and Tim has, for a lot of general elections. I've never seen anything quite like that, even in the depths of Theresa May. What on earth do they think they're doing? I mean, firstly, there are the optics. As you said, Johnny, the rain was pouring. For someone not to say, look, this is Rishi Sunak, who, I mean, he came to prominence being good at communications. That was the point, that people thought he was a bit too slick with all the Instagram stuff. What has gone wrong with the sort of confidence of his team? It's just basic judgment to say, you can't be sure that the rain's going to stay off for 4 or 5 minutes, stay inside. That's the first point. Then there's the presentation of it. I mean, I said before we went, when we were talking a few minutes ago, John, that he looked, that he'd been sounding recently down or depressed. I said, I hope the guy's okay. He has had a tough time as Prime Minister, but that was not a campaign speech. There was zero confidence in it at all. And then the substance. Who wrote that? I mean,
if committee. It felt like it was a committee. It didn't have a sort of a thread running through it.
If you're launching a general election campaign, you should. I mean, it should be punchy, upbeat, confident, and it should have within it phrases which are sort of properly delineated, which are going to be the key campaign phrases. Imagine Margaret Thatcher doing it, or David Cameron, or Tony Blair, or just about any of his predecessors. Well, but as I say, I'm pretty unshockable when it comes to politics, but that was a shocking performance.
And those were pretty damning reviews. If this was a first night set of reviews for a new production on the West End, it would be closing tomorrow. I don't want to focus. I want to make a very positive effort here not to focus too much or for too long, because we've heard the view and we saw what we saw, we discussed what we've seen. I don't want to focus too much on the theatrics and the appearances of what we've heard, because it's the beginning now of a process that will decide the direction of our country for years into the future. And I think it's pretty clear it's not going to be an easy trek for the Prime Minister or his government or his party, but this is the beginning and not the end. I want to get the view, our first view from, as it were, the shop floor, and say welcome to the programme, 2 Times Radio Drive, to Paul Scully, the former Conservative Minister and now backbench MP. Welcome to you, Paul.
Yeah, I think I might be an ex-MP. Yeah, I don't know, actually, because I'm not standing in the next election. So, good afternoon to you, John.
It's good to have you here, Paul. So, look, with no prompting from me, what did you make of that?
I was slightly frustrated this afternoon with all the female speculation, and I sort of agree with what Tim says, because, I've been doing this now for 27 years or something like that. I joined the party in 97, so I've seen the election at that time, and it just feels like we're going around full circle. And it doesn't take a headline writer to talk about the fact wet Tory speaks from a lectern. And we've got to now articulate a vision, because I think what we're doing now is that with this announcement is talking about we're not sure what's happening in the 6 months that's coming, so let's cut and run now. And what people want is certainty. They want the economy to carry on growing. They want those flights to go to Rwanda. But actually, we need to have the confidence as a party to say we have those answers. I'm not hearing it yet. So I want to get my successor in Sutton and Cheap. I want to get as many MPs to make sure that we're shaping the party in the months and the years to come. But we've got to do more about setting out our vision over the next few weeks.
Paul, is it going to be possible for MPs, ex-MPs, campaigners, party workers, those on the doorsteps in these coming weeks, to pull together and put on a united front? It's not a happy set of circumstances to announce a general election. We discussed that. But during a campaign, it's imperative that a party holds together, does not undermine its leader, puts on the best show possible. Is that going to be possible, do you think?
Yes, but it works both ways because actually, you've got to lead from the front. So the leader has to show that power, and the cabinet has to do that as well, and all the people in their own particular areas. And then you get the volunteers and the activists to come out and actually, share the vision. But you need that vision in the first place. So actually, we've got to work together, and we've only got now a few weeks to do this. But this isn't necessarily. I mean, I'm reasonably good at maths. I can add up. It's not necessarily about us leading the country for the next 5 years, but it's for us being a credible opposition at the very least, and a credible party that is a repository for people that still believe in centre-right values of opportunity, freedom, and aspiration.
You were there. I mean, look again. I always sort of had this I don't know, rider that I don't want to be seen to be focusing too much on the theatricalities of it, or the appearances, the optics, as it were, because there's a lot of substance now to go through in this coming campaign. But as those things go, and they are a part of politics, couldn't have been very much worse.
No, it really couldn't. And actually, I think it is quite important in this instance to focus on that, because this is not something the Prime Minister has been forced into doing. This is a choice that he has made. And election campaigns are all about choices. They are entirely based on leadership. And actually, Rishi Sunak, in his speech, pitched this as a battle for Downing Street between two men. And one of those men today has made a series of decisions that nobody at this point can really understand. Why would you give a speech in torrential rain in Downing Street without an umbrella? Why would you give a speech that didn't appear to give a reason for you calling an election campaign now? And actually, I came away from Downing Street and I was walking with somebody who's very senior in Rishi Sunak's inner circle, who was also walking out of Downing Street at the same time. And I said, why now? What's the justification for now? And they sort of tried to brush it off and said, well, we've always said the, second half of the year. And I said, yeah, but that's not a reason, is it? What's the reason? There must be a reason. Oh, well, it's good timing. We've had some good economic news. It's starting to look better. That's always been his thing. And I said, well, yes, but why not give it more time to bed in? And they came eventually to the answer. Well, it was going to be a long summer of lots of things going wrong, and we didn't want to be the ones sat there in Downing Street when they went wrong.
Yeah.
And for me, it goes to what we were talking about before, actually, which is that really it wasn't a reason for, it was a reason not to. Yes. And that's never necessarily the best justification for doing anything, really.
It's a pretty frank conversation. The desire to avoid doing what we now talk of as a mistake, the mistake of Gordon Brown, the mistake of James Callaghan, and just going later rather than sooner. And that in that way, just getting it wrong, taking more pain than was necessary.
I mean, they also, sorry to interrupt, they also did say, by the way, that they had picked up an increasing, and we all know that this has been the case for a while, but an increasing sense from the public that people are just fed up. And they are, the more we talk about politics, the less people engage with it. And they were worried that the risk is the longer you push it, the even less credit people would give the Tories, so actually things could get worse for them.
And Tim, you're nodding your head vigorously.
Well, I've always been worried that while I can completely understand why the Prime Minister would play it long in the hope that something would turn up, we don't need to remind listeners, John, of every day almost there is a negative news story that's dogging the Conservatives, whether it's a scandal, whether it's the rumour of defection, whether it's today, the party of law and order telling the police not to make too many arrests because they don't want the prisons full. And I think, the likelihood of that drumbeat of bad news continuing as against something wonderful turning up, the Bank of England don't seem to be very enthusiastic to really cut interest rates in a way that would make a difference, I think has caused the party to run and cut their losses, really. What I hope now, I think every Tory activist, every Tory MP is hoping is the party can't turn round its own fortunes. The country is not going to fall in love with the Conservative Party over the next 6 weeks. But what it can do is attach a price to Labour. What's the cost of it? And that's why, again, sorry, I'm being negative, but why was the Prime Minister talking about Labour don't have a plan? Vagueness. That's not going to upset people very much.
Because you want to be able to define the cost of...
Say that Labour have a secret plan. They must have a secret plan. Say that there's only one way. They come onto every programme and they say there's cuts in spending, but they don't say how they're going to do anything. They should bring a price tag on Labour.
Yeah, off. the button has been pressed, the firing gun has been started, and the rest, well, you know how it goes from here. Well, actually, none of us know how it goes from here, because that's one of the things we're looking forward to. Kate Ferguson rubbing her hands with a unique kind of enthusiasm. I want to welcome now to the studio Lord Bethell, former Conservative Health Minister. Welcome to you.
Good evening, John.
So we've had a lot of discussion, Lord Bethell, about the Prime Minister's speech, and people saying it lacked vision, it lacks a kind of clarity you need in an election campaign. Did you see what those critics did not see? Did you see a clarity and a vision there? What was it?
Well, Kate put it well. There wasn't a huge amount of drama. There wasn't a big sort of Clarkson's Farm type show on Earth. There wasn't a sort of Wolfie Smith type appeal to your beta instincts. So it was missing a lot of the things that we have come accustomed to in politics. But these two people, they're really pitching to be your bank manager at a time of financial pressure and geopolitical uncertainty. They're going for that solid central appeal. Now, I think Kate is right. There's not a lot of positivity in that. But what there was a sense of confidence and surety. And that's clearly what they're both pitching for. And we all pick up our emotional cues from sometimes quite small micro gestures, not always from the big drama.
Right, Kate is nodding.
Yeah, I really think that's an important point. And I think, John, it's what we were talking about earlier, wasn't it? About you were saying the rain is a problem and the music is a problem, and some people might dismiss it and say that stuff doesn't matter. But I actually think it really does matter. And I also think when I was listening to Rishi Sunak's, the start of his speech, I had this sudden moment where my tummy sort of flipped and I thought, oh my goodness, have we called this wrong? Is he actually resigning? Because the tone of the speech...
You really thought that was possible?
Yeah, because the tone of the speech was, I did everything for you in the pandemic. I made sure that you were safe in the pandemic. I've always promised you that. And I thought, God, this sounds like the type of thing that you say when you are telling people that you're proud of what you've achieved and you're going to move on. He obviously then did shift it, but the message only shifted to, look, I know you're all not feeling it yet, but I promise you I'm going to get you there. For me, after 14 years in office, that isn't the most convincing argument for an election campaign.
Yeah.
A problem for politicians, and by the way, this is in several countries, not just in Britain, is that if you try to pitch a big positive story, which is what we have grown to expect and what you would normally regard as normal political currency, the voters don't believe you because they don't trust politicians at all on anything. And if you try to tell a story of sunny uplands and delivery and the things that you're going to guarantee the voters, you can find that is really counterproductive because you actually come across as untrustworthy. I know what Kate means, that it did have a tone to it, and of course the rain didn't help at all. But what I think he's trying to go for is trust and being reliable and being someone that you can relate to. And he's going to try and roll out the positive messages in the election campaign ahead.
I wonder how the Prime Minister, how Rishi Sunak, does that from where we are now, because we are where we are. And I look at the opinion polls as you do, as we all do, and the Prime Minister's own personal ratings are pretty dismal. They are pretty poor. People have turned. He was pretty popular, comparatively speaking, when he took over from Liz Truss after the debacle of those 49 days of Liz Truss's premiership. He was more popular than the party. That's not the case anymore. Is that reversible?
I think conceptually it's reversible. And I was a journalist in 1992 when John Major pulled it out of the hat. It was the most extraordinary turnaround. No one really thought that was going to happen. I think one of the things he's got going for him is the economy. And one of the reasons, surely, in that discussion when they decided to go ahead was good economic news does create a feel-good factor in the nation. Now, there's lots of people hurting. The cost of living crisis is still with us. Plenty of people still struggling. But you do get the feeling that the economy has turned a corner. And on that, he does have a point, I think.
Well, I could say except that we know that inflation has come down. We're close to the Bank of England's target now, but Citi thought it was going to be more than that. And now the expectations of cuts in interest rates.
Yes.
And we're only talking about, one or two cuts of 25 basis points, a quarter point each side. The timing of that seems to be slipping rather than advancing. So even if we had more by way of cuts before election day, and how can that happen? It takes time for that stuff to sink in, and people are still hurting.
That's true. And speculation on interest rates has proved to be incredibly unreliable in the last
day
couple
to
of
day,
years.
yeah.
I know. But you are right. There's not going to be a big game-changing cut in interest rates between now and election day.
Where does the feel-good come from?
But the feel-good, it comes from people's sense of where the country is heading. And as we go into summer, there is a feeling that the increase in prices has slowed down. I know that's not the same as them coming down, and that job security is going up, and that the prospects for things getting better have improved. That you'll remember that in 1997, and I'm going to argue against myself a bit here. You definitely felt the green shoots, and we ran a sort of green shoots poll at the time. That actually worked out very well for Labour and for Tony Blair, because people decided that although things were getting better, they weren't going to vote for John Major. But it wasn't just that the figures were improving, it was the sense in the country that the economy had turned a corner.
You're entitled to argue against yourself in this forum. I do that on a daily basis, if I'm perfectly honest. Kate Ferguson.
Yeah, I was going to say two things. Number one, I think that we're so used, aren't we, to this idea that politicians, their big pitch for a general election should be a hopeful pitch. We've had this lots with Rishi and also with Keir, like, come on, where's your message of hope? But actually, I was talking this about with some people last year, and they said, Kate, you keep banging on about hope. The next election's going to be fought on fear. Fear for the economy, fear for our national security, and who can win the argument over security and protection, meaning security at work, security at home for your family, but also security on an international stage. So I think we're just looking at a bit of a different election to, say, 2019, which was much more kind of bullish and bluster and we can get stuff done. Oh, sorry, John.
No, I was going to say, if it's about that, Kate, if it's about stick with what you know, don't stick your neck out, don't take a chance with a lot who aren't tested, who may not have the experience that you want, then we're talking about a shift from positive to negative campaigning, aren't we? It's not just enough to say, trust me. You need to say, don't trust them, which is the way campaigning happens a lot of the time. Would that be a wise or good thing to do, do you think, Lord Bethel?
It's not just, I don't think that, I'm not against negative campaigning, and all campaigns need really good negative campaigning to work well, because you have to differentiate your product from the other guy too. But if you go and sit in focus groups with the public today and talk to them about what's on their mind, it is, as Kate said, anxiety about the future for their payday at the end of the month, for their children's prospects, for their parents and how they're being looked after. Those are the questions that are on people's mind. If you roll in and start talking about get-rich schemes and how it's all going to be fine and we're going to be a booming economy, and it's that lands so badly, but given the mood of where people are today. So both Keir and Rishi have picked up on this a bit, and in their own way are trying to emote reassurance and confidence. Now, it makes pretty tedious telly, and it doesn't give you the entertaining story that, certainly Corbyn and Johnson did in 2019. That was more knockabout fun. But it is appealing to where people are, I think, in their sentiment.
Hi, what's your mood right now? It's happened. The button's been pressed. We're off. How are you feeling?
Well, of course, I'm not going to be a candidate in this general election. In fact, as a member of the House of Lords, I'm not even going to get a vote in the general election. So
you're not completely detached, though, Nikki, are you? Or are you?
No, I'm not completely detached. And I have, of course, spoken to friends who are going to be candidates. And I think there's a mixture, isn't there, of, I think, slight shock. Nobody expected this to be happening today. And I've just been talking to business managers in the House of Lords about what's going to happen in terms of what's called wash up, which is what happens to the bills that we're going through and how all that's going to work. I think there's a mixture of relief, which is, in a way, we've been waiting for this for an awful long time, and good to get on with it. But also, I think everyone is slightly taken aback by the timing of now. And I'm sure that will be the big topic of conversation for the next few days before we get into the campaign.
Well, certainly for the next few seconds then. Why do you think now?
I think today's inflation figures, although not perhaps as low as expected, did signal, and I think one of your contributors was just saying about the view that actually the economy is in a better place. Although, as Rishi Sunak said on the doorstep of Downing Street, it's not. There are still people obviously who are absolutely struggling. But he talked very much, as you'd expect a former chancellor to do, that economic stability was going to be a big part of this election. I think that's absolutely right. He talked about the plan. I think there's also an element of, everybody was asking, when is it going to happen? And I think he probably thought, well, actually, sooner or later, I've got to, the one thing you do as Prime Minister is this very lonely decision of calling election, but you seize the agenda. And I think you do it at the moment when, you're ready and everyone else, the opponents are not ready. And therefore you go for it.
Nikki, look, you are a one nation Tory. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is more to the right of the party. You were, as it were, a Remainer, and the Prime Minister was a Brexiteer. I know at election time this is maybe a sort of naive and silly question to ask a Conservative, but do you think the Prime Minister is an asset or a liability? And if so, tell me why.
I think the Prime Minister is an asset. And I think why? Because I used to sit next to him in cabinet, and he is a thoroughly decent, fair-minded individual.
Yeah.
Who actually, when he says, he's going to do something, and that's what he said today, it's very much about, I said I was going to do this, and I've done it. And the furlough scheme, which he talked about, which we shouldn't forget, billions of pounds spent supporting businesses and individuals in terms of getting through the pandemic. Very much a Rishi Sunak design scheme. And I think that actually that will come out more and more during the campaign. And I think there comes a point where actually I suspect that both he and others, it's sort of, I can sit in Westminster for so long talking about what I want to do in the campaign, or I just call the election and get out there and start campaigning and connecting. And I think that's what he's decided to do.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely convincing. Let's just let's get on with it, because I can't wait to get started. That's not why people call elections. You call elections because you think either I've got a better chance going now than any other time, or you think maybe it would just be worse if I go later. Maybe both of those things. He is going now because he's worried about what might happen if he doesn't. That's the reality, surely.
I mean, look, we'll probably not know until Tim Shipman's written his next book on this period of history. And at that point, we'll perhaps unravel it. But I do think there's a combination probably of factors. But I think that this point about everyone's talking about it, I've done a lot of what I wanted to do. I can say that actually my 5 pledges are either met or on the way to being met. Got the Rwanda bill through. And actually there comes a point where I think that when an election's in the offing, that the whole of government starts to slow down. It becomes impossible to plan any more than a matter of weeks ahead.
Yes.
I think that probably the chances of having another big fiscal event in the autumn with potential tax cuts became less and less possible.
Right.
So in a way, you might as well just go for it.
You accept that then, Nikki? You accept that public borrowing going in the wrong direction, as it were, meant the Chancellor just didn't have the room for an election-winning pre-election budget. That's your take too.
Well, I think, I've been quite clear and consistent for a while now that actually I think that what people wanted is this economic stability which Rishi Sunak has brought. And people weren't looking. They know that there is obviously a lot of competing priorities. The 2.5% increase in defence spending, for example, as we live in an increasingly uncertain world. And so actually, I think probably it was hard enough to deliver the budget in March in terms of the debate between whether you cut income tax or national insurance. To go through around those houses again, I think would have been, with another OBR forecast, would have been difficult. And I think one of the things that lots of people outside government who need government to be functioning, to be spending money, need is what's called a spending review, where you plan government expenditure the next couple of years. That can't happen now until we've had an election.
Yeah, and Nikki, you're in danger of sounding optimistic about the Tory party's chances.
I'm always optimistic at the start of an election because I know there are plenty of campaigns where the unexpected can happen, and until you get on those doorsteps in the country talking to people, and I think that we'll just have to see. Look, you've covered plenty of campaigns, John, where things have gone awry for even the parties that are meant to be in the lead.
Yes, I have. But when you talk about unexpected, you include in your definition of unexpected astonishing, I take it.
But as I say, I was there in the 2017 general election. If you remember at that time when we were all told, no, Theresa May was going to have this big majority and that was going to give her massive amounts of freedom to do what she wanted in Parliament, and it didn't turn out like that. 2015, we were told that Edmund Aband and Labour were going to do incredibly well. That didn't happen. 2019, when actually a much bigger majority. There's no complacency at all. You have to fight for every single vote, but there will be surprising results. We'll have to see on the 4th of July when we get to 10:01 what the exit poll tells us.
Well, no one's voted. That much is absolutely true. Kate Ferguson.
Hi, Nikki. Are you confident enough to put a flutter on, do you think? And also, the actual real question is, people haven't kind of warmed to Rishi Sunak. The public hasn't warmed to him as a political leader. Do you think there's time for him to turn that around? How can he try and make people warm to him, do you think?
So no, I never put money on, thanks. I never answer maths questions. I never put money on anything. There's lots of things that I've learned not to do.
But Kate Ferguson will bet you lunch. She's in the habit of doing that.
Well, we'll talk about where that lunch might be. It might be tempting. Do I think that people will warm to Rishi Sunak? Yes, because I think that actually what you see in campaigns are often the real politicians unvarnished, both when things go well and things don't go so well. But I think part of this and part of what he was trying to set out today is less about people warming to him and more about, we live in a very uncertain world. These are things I've done. I think I've done what I said I was going to do, and I'd like to do more. And this is why I'd like to be in power for another 5 years. And people will have. I mean, he mentioned the word I thought was very interesting. The speech was very much directed at us. I'm not the electorate, as I've just said, but other people who are going to be the electorate. It was about you, your choice. This is up to you. And I think that's what that's what elections do. Is they stop people just responding to polls and make people make a decision about who they're going to vote for.
Nikki Morgan, Baroness Morgan, lovely to talk to you as always, Nikki. Let's talk again soon. It is always a pleasure. Now, here's some of your thoughts listening to this. This is Paul's thought. Do you think he's gone for an election before there were any more defections? Well, there's a thought. Ian says, just wondering, guys, what's the collective noun for Kates? And this is in from John.
Terrifying.
Terrifying. Has anyone mentioned the fact the European Football Championships is on during the election campaign? The feel-good factor. We haven't touched on that, actually. That is an interesting point. Harold Wilson tried that. I mean, that was at least discussed during Harold Wilson's time back in the day. I'm not sure it did work out quite that way, but it always comes up at election time. Is there a football tournament? And sure enough, there is, coming up in the next few weeks.
I haven't got anything to say to you on football. Kate might have more on that, but I do have a little bit of news for you, and it's something that we should watch out for over the next couple of days, because it's a personal statement. Holly Lynch, who's a Labour MP for Halifax, is announced she's going to be standing down, and I think we're probably going to be seeing more of these MPs over the coming days, which means re-selections. It means choosing new candidates. Not a huge amount of time to do that, has to be said. She says that the pressures of basically a young family, and working in Parliament, it means that she's changed her priorities and she's been thinking about it, and she's not going to continue as an MP. But it's interesting, and there will be others who will want to do the same.
There will. We need to watch that, don't we?
Yeah.
Don't we, guys? I mean, there's been some sort of chatter and speculation about the complexion of the next set of parties in Parliament. One of our listeners was texting earlier on, suggesting that the Labour Party would be shifting further to the left, as if the party grows, there'll be more left-wingers. However, I think the evidence that we've seen so far is that the centre of the Labour Party headquarters has had a pretty tight hold on the selection of candidates, and they've managed to ensure that as and when the party grows, and expectation is that it will grow, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite... we weren't really expecting Holly Lynch to necessarily do this. We're really braced for more Tories to resign, aren't we, Kate, than Labour? Because Labour are obviously the ones kind of with power within their grasp. Labour HQ have had an iron grip on this selection process for their MPs. People should be under no illusion. Yes, there may be a couple of left wingers, but this is Starmer's selection process, and we expect that to be quite a moderate, very Starmer loyalist intake that we're getting at the next election. So you would not expect kind of the socialist campaign group, which are the kind of left-wing Labour MPs, to particularly beef up their ranks here. In fact, they may end up being diminished as some leave at the election and then not replenished.
And what about the makeup of the next Parliamentary Conservative Party? Because, look, as I say, need to say, we don't know what's going to happen. People haven't voted yet, but a lot of those marginal seats are in the so-called red wall areas, in the Midlands, in the north, where you have a lot of right-leaning former Boris Johnson supporters. If they are going to succumb to a swing, it doesn't take a huge swing, then you're going to see a change in the complexion of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, Kate.
Sunak bets the House is the headline in the Times this morning over a picture of a rain-soaked PM in front of number 10. The odds are stacked against him. YouGov's latest polling for the paper, out in the last half hour or so, gives Labour a 25-point lead. Let's talk to one of those caught up in the gamble, the former Minister and Conservative MP for Bournemouth East, Tobias Ellwood, who has a majority of just shy of 9,000. Let's speak to him now. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Are you 1,000% behind this decision? Was it the right decision?
Absolutely, it was the right decision. I understand the speculation that you've just been discussing there. But from the bigger picture, you cannot have us going to the polls when the United States also goes to the polls as well. We cannot have two countries, Britain and America, involved in domestic issues when an adversary, a competitor, would take full advantage of us looking in a different way, distracted. A prime opportunity to do something significant.
That's
and
not
I'm
the reason
sure
he's.
that the
That's
White
not the
House-
reason he's. That's not the reason he's done this. Surely, Tobias Elwood. He's not done this because he wants to. He could have done it in September or October for that reason. That's not the reason.
No,
he's done this.
not well. Of course, you can have your perspective. I'm looking from the bigger position. This is where I look at things from a security perspective. It's long been known that you cannot have both Britain and America. It's like an unwritten rule going to the polls at the same time. So you can dismiss it. All I'm saying is that it limited the calendar as to when things are going to happen. But what I would say, it's election year, 2024. We should not be surprised when the Prime Minister then comes out and says, we're going to go to the polls. So let's stop whinging about it. Let's get in line. Let's suck it up, grab your leaflets and get out on the campaign trail.
Are some of your colleagues whinging about it, do you think?
Well, you've actually been commenting on that to say.
I'm just asking if you heard it. Have anyone whinged to you, Tobias? Have you heard someone whinging about it?
I'm not going to go on radio and talk about whinging. I'm going to talk about what we need to do. I mean, that's a facile conversation, if I might say so. Okay. I'm just making it very, very clear that the gun has now been fired. We now need to make the case as to whether we're actually going to offer a direction of travel, given where the economy is going, given where security is required as well, because storm clouds are gathering as well. But the bigger issue, which sort of goes back to what we're talking about, is showing a sense of discipline as well, a passion, a desire to want to remain in number 10. And if we look unified, if we have a sense of purpose, we actually can do well. But if we go in there with the resolve that we're not going to do well, that we might actually lose, then yes, we probably will lose as well. So it's up to us as to whether we lose badly, lose well, get a hung parliament, or even defy everybody and actually pull off a win.
Can you crystallise the offer? I mean, we just had Labour on, and clearly their offer has changed. They said change 9 times in the conversation. Time for change is very much their slogan. What's the Conservative slogan, do you think? What's the if distill it down to something, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, it is that. You've got to say that anybody going into the polls now will say, do you vote for the people that are there right now, or do you vote for change? It always comes down to that binary answer. But the bigger question is, who do you actually want as custodians of our economy? Who do you want actually leading our country, given the challenges, as I say, that are actually growing? Life is going to get tougher, not easier. And we've had 2 seismic challenges over the last few years that actually would have tested any government. We've come through that. We've moved Britain into calmer economic waters. Inflation is back to 2%. UK growth is better than on the continent. Business confidence is returning. Bank of England expected to cut interest rates. So that is going to be factored in. It's, Clinton was right. It's still the economy. It's how it affects individuals, their wallets, their bank accounts, their families, and how do we actually move forward from the challenge of the cost of living.
And if that was the case, though, and on that point, though, Tobias, but that's an interesting point there. If that was the case, would that not be better to wait for that effect to come for the next couple of months before having the election? Because the argument might be actually that otherwise it looks like Rishi Sunak considers this to be the high watermark. Things aren't going to get any better than they look as of July this year.
Well, we've just discussed about what the timings are. They're very limited, in fact, as when you can do it, given you're not going to do it over the Christmas period. So we're going over the old discussion again. We're not going to do it over the Christmas period. We can't do it in October, November because of the reasons I mentioned. Therefore, you're going to go in July. But the other thing about, if I can make the case of having the general election, having the gun fired, is that we've come under a huge amount of scrutiny, the Conservative Party, quite rightly, given perhaps some of the suboptimal headlines. What this campaign now provides is a genuine opportunity for the electorate to learn what actually Labour stands for, because most people don't do that. So they're going to be in a better position to judge, which party is best placed to do that. Campaigns obviously expose this. All policies are stress tested. All manifestos are now scrutinised. That is a good thing for the electorate to be better informed.
How close to a manifesto are you, do you think? It's an interesting point, because the argument that Labour have been waiting for this for so long, they're relatively close to a manifesto. Do you feel confident that there is a Tory manifesto that you will agree with that can be released relatively quickly? How close to it are we, do you feel?
Yeah, I'm sure that will be rolled out. We've got to wrap up Parliament, first of all. That's the next focus that we're going to be on the next few days. But certainly there'll be the manifesto launches. And don't forget, we've also got those There's campaigns, the leadership contest as well, which will give another insight as to who's best placed to continue.
Could that
leading the
manifesto
country in these
include?
difficult
Could that
times.
manifesto include coming out of the ECHR? I mean, because are there some issues that are not settled? So that Rishi Sunak could be having this debate now and saying, well, actually, the right of my party wants to come out of the ECHR. That could be part of the manifesto. Is that still on the table? Do you feel?
Not at all, and don't think it ever was on the table. It's not what Britain does. We actually craft international laws, but we also revise them when they're required. So I'm sure that the policy line that we're going to see is, yes, we abide by it, but it was written in the 1950s. It's, Churchill was one of the architects of this. It's very much not just a British thing, but a conservative thing. But it does need updating, and I'm sure that perhaps might enter it. But the idea that we would leave the ECHR, it has been mad for a long. It would never even get through the House of Lords. So let's park that one.
That's a good idea. Your majority is under 9,000. How worried are you, Tobias Ellwood, about your job?
Well, you actually make another point about what people are voting for, because it isn't just who runs the country.
Yeah.
It's also who's going to represent you, who's going to have the competence in Parliament, not only to stand up for your constituency, but occasionally perhaps challenge things, even from your own party that's required. And I want to see strong personalities remain in Parliament. Ever fewer people are stepping forward into public life, and that's a sad thing. And then don't forget, of course, it's you want good people to stand, because it's from that gene pool that government, that cabinet is then selected as well. So there's a local decision to be done as to who represents you, and I do hope that I'll have the honour to continue representing Bournemouth East.
At the risk of being accused of being facile, Tobias, what did you make of the launch then? I mean, does it matter? Rishi Sunak standing in the rain, looking sad, while someone plays things can only get better. Does that actually matter at all? Did you have any things? Oh, come on, we can start better than this, or do you think it's something no one can think about?
Can we undo it? Can we unpick it? No, of course we can't. You can enjoy it. Clearly, perhaps people would have done things differently. I think there's going to be a number of moments during this campaign where all parties would have said, oh, wow, I might have done something differently. Yeah. The importance of yesterday. Actually, it was Craig McKinley that stole the show yesterday. Where you saw him walk in to the chamber. That moment there will live with me for the rest of my life. But yesterday, the gun has been fired. Let's get on with the campaign. Let's get out. Let's make our case.
What's happening inside the Conservative Party this morning? Are MPs delighted to be able to take the fight to Labour to the doorstep, or are the whispers from the politicians' WhatsApp groups correct? Are they a little bit mystified as to why they're having an election in July? Let's ask Jacob Rees-Mogg, former Cabinet Minister, MP for North East Somerset, who has a majority of more than 14,000. Good morning to you.
Hello, good morning.
When did you first learn that this was on the cards?
That's a very good question. We were being strongly encouraged by Central Office to get on with as much campaigning as possible during the local elections. And we read into that there was a possibility of a July election, although we didn't quite believe that was what was going to happen. So that was the intimation, but I can't say to you, I thought, well, this is absolutely, definitely going to happen. Although Nigel Farage and I had a conversation on GB News where we both said that there would be an early election. But I'm not sure I was as confident as I may have sounded.
Right, okay. At what point yesterday did you know that it was going to be announced?
Oh, well, the gossip started, didn't it? And Downing Street wasn't denying it. And then there were all sorts of little signs reading the runes that a website at Central Office to get campaign literature stopped offering new literature, and the Chancellor cancelled interviews and the Foreign Secretary flew back. So the excitement of an imminent dissolution was building.
You've had a few chats then, cosy chats with Nigel Farage. What can you tell us about his future plans?
Well, I don't know. I'm in the dark as much as anybody. I'm sure he'll announce it fairly soon as to what he's going to do, but he's obviously a very significant political figure.
What do you think about what is your opinion about having an election on July the 4th? Is it too soon?
Well, it's a very nice way to celebrate my youngest son Sixtus's birthday, which he will be 7 on the 4th of July. So there may be some birthday cake in the midst of election day. But the Parliament could only run at the absolute latest to December with an election in January. and this is just a few months early. I think this is all within the broad mix, that whether it's a day here or a day there won't in fact make much difference.
What about what happened yesterday? It was, some people say it was a fairly inauspicious start to the campaign. Were you enthused by what you saw yesterday, Rishi Sunak standing in the rain, or were you a little bit embarrassed?
Oh, I thought it was absolutely magnificent. I thought it was
you?
just the best British stoicism, the stiff upper lip. We carry on regardless. The British are drip dry. We don't care about a little bit of drizzle. It was like carrying on a test match when a little bit of rain comes in and not wimping out for bad light. I thought it showed proper British grit.
Well, hardly any of the papers see it that way. Things can only get wetter, drowning streets. It's not great, is it? Is it really?
I was thinking more Singing in the Rain, the positive, upbeat message you get from one of the great films of all time, with Rishi Sunak starring as Gene Kelly.
Right. Okay. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. No one else seems to have had that take. But anyway, I want to go back to Nigel Farage, if I may, because we've spoken to all the political parties this morning, but we're not able to speak to Reform UK because they are keeping their powder dry until 11 o'clock when they're having this announcement or this event. How much of a threat do you think Nigel Farage and or Reform are to the Conservatives at the election?
Oh, they're obviously a very serious one, and I would appeal to my friends to Reform to look at what the effect of voting reform is, that no party has a right to votes. The Conservative Party doesn't, the Labour Party doesn't, but we are in a first-past-the-post system, and votes for reform make a socialist government more likely, a government that never previously has been good at the defence of the realm, that has never previously left office with unemployment anything other than higher than when it came in, and that last time round bankrupted the country. And so voting for reform helps Labour, whereas the Conservatives, particularly Conservatives like me, agree with the vast majority of what reform advocates.
One final thing I want to ask you about. It was reported last night that some backbenchers, Tory backbenchers, plotting to try to stop the election even being called, trying to put letters into Sir Graham Brady. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that. I think it'd be a silly thing to do, that the election's been called, the King has agreed to a dissolution, the prorogation has been agreed to precede the dissolution, that now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of the party, I think is a typing exercise, but it has resonance under these circumstances. Conservatives must back the Conservative leader, our manifesto, and get on and knock on doors and encourage people to vote Conservative.
Are you looking forward to knocking on doors, possibly in the pouring rain?
I love knocking on doors, and I have a good raincoat.
That doesn't sound very stoic. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much. Former Cabinet Minister, of course, MP for North East Somerset.
The argument we've heard from a couple of Tories today actually is, well, there was always going to be an election either in the early autumn, therefore summer isn't that different to the early autumn, so there's nothing really to see here. How surprised were you, Andrew? You've seen a fair few elections in your time.
I think I was completely baffled. I mean, I didn't see it coming. I didn't really believe he was going to do it till I heard the words coming out of his mouth in the rain. By the way, I just point out to Mr. Rees-Mogg that bad light does actually stop play at test matches, and so does rain. Rain stops play at test matches too. He clearly hasn't been to a test match in recent times, and I just think it's a nonsense to say that it makes no difference, have it in July versus November. Look, I think the Tories have a mountain to climb, near mission impossible to win this election, no matter when it is this year. But in my judgment, they had a better chance of pulling off the impossible in November than they have in July, in which I suspect now they're going to go down to a famous defeat.
I guess the point, though, Andrew, is maybe they think this is as good as it gets, because it strikes me that the argument they're going to try and run in this election is things are turning, the corner's turning, the economy is going to prosper. They can't really say that, because if that were true, they'd wait. If there was going to be an economy that was going to be better and better and better, it's much better to have the election in October or November than it is in July. Maybe they look at they think inflation is about where it's going to stay, and they've got the borrowing numbers weren't very good, so they can't cut taxes. The headroom's gone. They weren't going to be able to stop the boats. Maybe this is the high point. It just feels like a low point.
That is precisely what the Labour attack will be. I mean, they will say this is a cut and run election. Labour will say, the Prime Minister says things are getting better. But if they're getting better, as you say, why doesn't he wait so we can see that they're getting better? People are not going to change their vote on the basis of 1 month's inflation figures. Certainly people like you and me that follow these inflation figures on a monthly basis. People don't. People work out how much money they've got in their pay packets, what they've got after tax in their pockets. People need to be convinced that the economy is turning the corner. People need to be convinced that living standards are rising again, that inflation has truly been conquered, that interest rates are coming down. None of that will be provable this side of July the 4th. So Labour will have strong to say, what do they know that we don't know? What's coming round the corner? If things are getting better, why are we going to the country on July the 4th? And I think they've created a rod for their own back on this, and it will give Labour some very strong campaigning points to make.
Meanwhile, Labour, we've heard Labour on today. Pat McFadden came on. He said the word change 9 times. Keir Starmer issued a video with just the social media message was change full stop. Is that enough? Because some people are suspicious of Labour. They feel, how much is the militant left actually gone? Is it just waiting, quiescent, ready to rise again? How much can we really trust Keir Starmer? Because the message for Labour seems to be trust us to change, but don't worry, we're not going to change the things you don't want us to.
Time for a change is the most powerful campaign slogan in the democratic world. And if I was advising Labour, I would make that their campaign slogan, because it's what the country feels. After 14 years of Conservative government, the country feels that it is time for a change in the absence of any reasons why they shouldn't. But given, you see, this is not 1997, when it wasn't just that the country was fed up with the Tories, they actively wanted Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. That's not the case this time. They are fed up with the Tories, but they ain't gagging for Keir Starmer. They're not that convinced by it. It's more let's get rid of the Tories than any love for Labour. That's another reason for holding on. Despite Labour's strong, near impregnable lead in the polls, there is something quite flaky, something quite fragile about this Labour Party, and it's prone to self-inflicted mistakes. For example, this whole row over Angela Rayner, which could have been doused down within the first couple of weeks. Just take more recently, David Lammy's rather childish kind of student politician response to the International Court going after the Israeli Prime Minister. Keir Starmer's ability to turn on a sixpence when it comes to policies. When I interviewed him in the Labour leadership election campaign in early 2020, just on the eve of the pandemic, every single pledge he made on that interview with me, he had broken within under a year. Every single one. University tuition fees, nationalising energy companies, various other things that I'd forgotten now. And he said to me, these are not promises, Andrew, these are pledges. Well, I don't really understand the difference, but whatever the difference was, he broke them. So that's another reason for holding on, to see that some of Labour could have unravelled during the summer and into the autumn. But that ain't going to happen now either, because there's not enough time for July the 4th, which is why I repeat, I remain #baffled.
You've made the case in the Times why this was probably the right decision. Do you want to explain that to us? I've got some thoughts on it, but it's an interesting case you're making.
Let's start with this. Almost everybody who says this is a terrible idea is making an assumption that there was a very good date available if only Rishi Sunak had waited for it. But I think we all know that any date's going to be very difficult. So almost all the arguments that apply against the July date apply against an October date. Why is this a marginally better moment to pick? I think, first of all, because it'll be a time for a change election. Rishi Sunak has calculated that he doesn't want to allow that to build. Certainly my conclusion in 1997 was that we didn't gain an advantage by carrying on as long as we possibly could. We were waiting for something to turn up, but actually a lot of the things that turned up were bad things. Yeah. So they reduced our votes. They made it more difficult for us to get elected. And when governments are in power, the things that happen often rebound against them. So I think that's a calculation. Look, there is a possible argument on the economy that waiting until the autumn, it might be marginally better. But I think they've realised that they're not. That people aren't buying that particularly, and so they have opted for another advantage, which is this does put everybody's caught on the hop. A friend of mine called, he was in Japan yesterday, and he's, got election decisions to make. So it caught everyone in it by surprise. But most of all, it'll have caught reform by surprise. And very important in an election, one of the few things that can move is the vote split. In 2017, that's what did for Theresa May. And everyone said it was Corbyn's manifesto, or her manifesto, but it was more that Corbyn's manifesto managed to unite the left vote behind Labour. And the one thing the Conservative Party cannot have in this election is a surge in the reform vote. It'll make things worse. And this does put the reform on the back foot. It also means you don't coincide with Trump. You don't get the possibility of Rwanda having been introduced but not working. So all those reasons are reasons why this is a marginally better time.
I guess the thing I think they're all very fair points, and it may be that this is the least bad option, and that's what we've got to settle on. It strikes me that the economic argument, which is going to be so crucial to this election, is weakened, though, because if the case is we've made some tough decisions, we've turned the corner, we're making things better, you're going to feel better, then if that were true, people will feel even better in October and November than they do in May and June. And that seems to me to be the problem, that if they're trying to say things are getting better, why would you not wait till they got a little bit better still?
Because of these other reasons.
Yeah.
It depends. So the thing about political decisions is that there's always good arguments for both sides, and that's why we could argue about this all morning and never reach a resolution. And ultimately, the Prime Minister has to pick. By the way, reflecting on the fact this is quite a brave decision, now that he's made it in July, there'll be some people who then say, well, the reason they haven't done well is Rishi Sunak picked July. Yeah. So he's taking more of the burden on himself. Quite a bold thing to do. And I actually must admit, I'm a friend of his, and but I've been quite favourably impressed that he's made a bold decision of this kind, because he does take it on himself. A bit like, everyone still talks about Jim Callaghan's decision in 1978. Well, not everyone, but people do occasionally still talk
people
about
you hang out with.
So, John, to what extent is this a foregone conclusion? Could something happen over the next 6 weeks that defy the polls and surprise us all?
Well, of course, that is always possible, but the likelihood is undoubtedly extremely low. Certainly, the likelihood of something happening that means that we end up with Rishi Sunak remaining in 10 Downing Street seems particular. Let me just take you through one possible calculation. At the moment, on average, the opinion polls have Labour 21 points ahead. Now, the biggest turnaround in the lead during election campaign in recent elections is the 10-point fall in the Conservative lead in the 2017 election that Theresa May began with. So let's take 10 points off Labour's lead. That's still 11 points. Then let's add to that the biggest of the polling errors that has occurred in recent elections, which is the 9-point error back in 1992 in terms of overestimating Labour vis-à-vis the Conservatives. So we're now taking two extreme events, adding them together. So the probability of them both happening is inevitably quite low, let alone one of them. But we've still got Labour 2 points ahead. And here we don't have to remember the other problem that faces the Conservatives, which is not the polls and it's not the election. It's the parliamentary politics. Because although a 2-point lead undoubtedly means a hung parliament, and maybe even the Conservatives the largest party, it does still not necessarily point to a continuing Conservative administration, because neither the Liberal Democrats nor the SNP will be willing to vote for a minority Conservative King's Speech in a hung parliament. So the Conservatives have to get themselves virtually all the way back to 326 if Mrs Sunak is still to remain as Prime Minister.
So, John, to what extent is this a foregone conclusion? Could something happen over the next 6 weeks that defy the polls and surprise us all?
Well, of course, that is always possible, but the likelihood is undoubtedly extremely low. Certainly, the likelihood of something happening that means that we end up with Rishi Sunak remaining in 10 Downing Street seems particular. Let me just take you through one possible calculation. At the moment, on average, the opinion polls have Labour 21 points ahead. Now, the biggest turnaround in the lead during election campaign in recent elections is the 10-point fall in the Conservative lead in the 2017 election that Theresa May began with. So let's take take 10 points off Labour's lead. That's still 11 points. Then let's add to that the biggest of the polling errors that has occurred in recent elections, which is the 9-point error back in 1992 in terms of overestimating Labour vis-à-vis the Conservatives. That's still so we're now taking two extreme events, adding them together. So the probability of them both happening is inevitably quite low, let alone one of them. But we've still got Labour 2 points ahead. And here we don't have to remember the other problem that faces the Conservatives, which is not the polls and it's not the election. It's the parliamentary politics. Because although a 2-point lead undoubtedly means a hung parliament, and maybe even the Conservatives the largest party, it does still not necessarily point to a continuing Conservative administration, because neither the Liberal Democrats nor the SNP will be willing to vote for a minority Conservative King's Speech in a hung parliament. So the Conservatives have to get themselves virtually all the way back to 326 if Rishi Sunak is still to remain as Prime Minister.
And John, the news this morning, Nigel Farage announcing that he's thought long and hard about whether or not to stand in this election.
Sure.
Still supporting reform, but he says, I will do my bit to help in the campaign, but it's not the right time for me to go any further than that. How significant is that in terms of deciding whether or not this is a bad result for the Tories or a catastrophic one?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that polling 6 months ago suggested that Mr Farage to front the reform campaign, their support might double, but the truth is their support has doubled since then anyway. I think perhaps we're still not slightly clear as to how much Mr Farage will get involved. If he ends up campaigning a great deal, maybe he'll still make a difference. But I think what one needs to realise here is let's be pessimistic about reform. Let's say that once we get into the election campaign, as has happened before, certainly happened in 2019, the electorate do start to concentrate around Conservative Labour. In the case of reform voters, any squeeze is to return to the Conservatives. But remember, Richard, Mr Farage pulled the Brexit Party, the Reform Party's predecessor, out of Conservative-held constituencies back in 2019. Richard Tice is determined to fight those constituencies. So even if Reform are only fighting at, let's say, 5% nationally, that's probably going to mean at least 5% in most Conservative-held constituencies, up from 0 last time. Those votes are going to come disproportionately from the Conservatives, and therefore it will make it more difficult for the Conservatives to hang on in the seats they're trying to defend. And one of the problems the Conservatives face, despite beyond the levels of the polls, is two messages of the local elections. One, they're losing ground more heavily in places they're previously strongest. And two, some voters seem inclined to vote tactically for whichever Labour or the Liberal Democrats are better able to defeat them. All of this, one has to say, is almost a mirror image of what was the position before the 1997 election, when indeed all of this also then came to pass. So history is not bound to repeat itself, but history stands against Mr Sunak being able to pull it off.
This is the first poll conducted entirely since the general election was announced. And what we found was that the Labour Party enjoys a lead of 17 points over the Conservatives. Labour on 44%, the Conservatives on 27%, and then Reform further back on 10%. And that is, it goes without saying, that means the Conservatives start this election campaign at a significant deficit to Labour. They are behind. There is a big gap to close.
Yeah, I mean, other polling organisations have different numbers because they have different methodologies. But according to your model, your way of doing things, that is a striking number. You've never seen a deficit like this on day one of a campaign. I mean, there's so many numbers in here which really catch your eye, aren't there? The mood of time for a change. You've actually had a good stab at measuring it.
Well, absolutely. So in that same poll, we asked people, is it time for a change or should we stick with the plan? We tested that Conservative line about sticking with the plan. And what came back was 70% of the public said it was time for change. 30% said we should stick with the plan. And we then asked about the two leaders. Do they represent change or do they represent status quo? And perhaps unsurprisingly, 81% said that Rishi Sunak represented the status quo. But what was interesting, and this is a change since January, was 51% said Keir Starmer represented change, 49% said he didn't. So it's quite narrow. But when we asked in January, it was the other way round. 59% said that Keir Starmer would be more of the same. Only 41% said change. So what's happened is since January, Keir Starmer has moved ahead on that change metric. And I think the Labour Party will be quite pleased with that. It's been in all of their branding that we've seen over the course of the past few days, that word change, really trying to tap into it.
Yeah, I mean,